Hello and welcome to the European Report. Today we are not in the European Parliament because the European Parliament is currently in recess as there is European parliamentary elections taking place right across the continent, and all 28 member states are involved in those elections. So in this programme today we're in our studios in London to discuss the state of the Middle East peace talks, and in this programme today I'm joined by my good friend Zalmi Unsdorfer from Likud Harut. Hi, Zalmi, it's good to have you on the programme. I know that you've recently been in Israel. You're a regular guest on the Middle East Report. Can you share with our viewers what it was like to celebrate Passover, or Pesach in Hebrew, in Jerusalem?
We had a record influx of tourists of all persuasions. We had the Christians, we had the Jews, we had all kinds. And it was just absolutely wonderful, a very, very pastoral feeling. Everyone involved in their own kind of pilgrimage, and it was just fabulous. And I think most people have a view when they read things like the New York Times, or they watch TV. They have an assumption that there's missiles flying in everywhere in Israel. It couldn't have been more peaceful and more well organized. So really a great experience.
As a religious Jew, what does it mean for you to actually be able to celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, fulfilling the dreams and aspirations of your ancestors?
Well, Passover is all about being freedom. And for generations, for 2,000 years, Jews have always said next year in Jerusalem, during the Haggadah, the reading of the Haggadah on the Seder evening. And now we have it. And those Jews who are, and we're all free to go there. Unfortunately, it just needs a little bit more persuasion to get Americans to make that trip. I think more Jews need to come and enjoy the festivals in Jerusalem. There's a saying, use it or lose it. And that's my feeling.
Because I remember last year being in Jerusalem for Pesach, and it was a very special experience, seeing the buzz of the activity in Jerusalem, and seeing so many of the religious Jews going down to the Western Wall, the Kotel Hamaravi, to pray, and it's just comes alive, and it's such a special time to be in Israel during the high holidays or the high feasts.
Yes, it's an amazing feeling. It's a restoration of a nation's dreams in its homeland, which is wonderful. You just can't put any other adjectives on it. It's just absolutely almost dreamlike.
And in today's programme, we're really discussing the state of the Middle East peace talks, because the US Secretary of State John Kerry has given a deadline of the 29th of April. So clearly we've moved on from there. Where do you think we are now in terms of the peace process? Because the Palestinians are blaming the Israelis, and the Israelis are blaming the Palestinians, and the Americans are blaming the Israelis.
Well, I think people can argue about this till the cows come home. The fact of the matter is that in this latest round, and we've seen, I don't know, must be a dozen rounds, the Y agreement, the Tenet plan, the Rogers plan, the Y agreement, the Geneva Accord. I mean, I think that you've got to run out of countries pretty soon to use as labels for the various peace negotiations. I think at the end of the day, it's very, very clear. Israel has given everything, and the Palestinians have given nothing. Israel has given up prisoners, killers, much to the chagrin and the grief of widows and orphans, people who've really been traumatized, and they've actually been re-traumatized watching these people leaving jail and celebrating on the bus, and then being received in Ramallah by our so-called peace partner as heroes, and having streets named after them, and then being given salaries to set them back up again. This is an egregious betrayal of the principles of peace. And all we asked for at the end of the day was just, would you just recognize us as the Jewish state? I mean, how can you sign an agreement with someone who doesn't recognize you? How can I sell a car to someone if I can't show that the car belongs to me, or that you don't recognize that it's my car to sell? What did they give? Absolutely nothing. They gave the privilege of being able to sit down at a table. And in fact, Netanyahu was under great political pressure, almost the splitting of his coalition and his own party, on the final tranche of prisoners, the most hardened prisoners. And you're talking about prisoners who have Israeli citizenship, which would be like letting loose killers in Britain. not political prisoners, but actual citizens who'd murdered other citizens, releasing them. And Israel was prepared to release that last lot, and in fact, a total of 400, just to have Abbas, in exchange for Abbas extending the talks. And he wouldn't even do that because, as we now know, he'd done a deal with Hamas and worked out an exit plan weeks and weeks before.
And we have a news clip to go to now that highlights the stalling of the Middle East peace process.
President Barack Obama is investing more in the Middle East peace process, meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he is scheduled to meet with Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. While the White House is investing more in the negotiations, analysts here in Washington are skeptical anything will come of the talks. Speaking to the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee during his recent trip to Washington, the Israeli leader said he was ready to make a deal.
I'm prepared to make a historic peace with our Palestinian neighbors, a peace that would end a century of conflict and bloodshed.
Aaron David Miller, a former peace process negotiator for the United States and advisor to secretaries of state for more than 2 decades, is pessimistic about the current conditions.
There is no conflict-ending agreement available right now to Israelis and Palestinians.
Miller's pessimism is broadly reflective of the mood in Washington, but that has not deterred the U.S. Secretary of State, John Kerry, from devoting a huge amount of time and effort to reaching a deal.
But what it's going to require to close this conflict down, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, border security, Jerusalem, recognition of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, finality of claims, and security, what it's going to take to close those 6 issues down is a degree of will we haven't seen and a degree of skill.
Ahead of his trip to Washington, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas has said he will not accept Prime Minister Netanyahu's insistence on recognition of Israel as a Jewish state. Former peace negotiator and special advisor for the Israeli government, Daniel Levy, says the issue is not going to be resolved.
This Jewish state issue is being raised to the level of poking the Palestinians in the eye with it, in a way that is intentionally making it increasingly impossible for Abbas to accept, even if there was an ability to do that in some way at some stage.
With time running short before the self-imposed April deadline, some suggest it is time to openly acknowledge that the conditions are not right for an imminent breakthrough.
Look at this as a 3-year plan, not a 3-week plan or a 6-week plan through to the end of April. And don't get the framework agreement wrong now. I would actually say better to continue the talks with no framework than with the kind of framework that is being discussed.
Those discussions will continue when Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas arrives here in Washington for his meetings with U.S. President Barack Obama. Ahead of those talks, the Obama administration announced the Initiative for the Palestinian Economy, hoping that corporate investment and profits will help boost the local economy and peace for the region.
And we're now joined on the phone by Richard Pater, who heads up the BICOM offices in Jerusalem. Richard, welcome to the European Report. Can you give us a bit of your background? I believe you made Aliyah some years ago, and that you were a tank commander and you're a reservist in the IDF now, and you also are director of BICOM's offices in Jerusalem.
That's correct. Thank you very much for having me, first of all. Yes, I grew up and born and educated in the UK. I graduated Manchester University in politics and philosophy and moved to Israel 15 years ago at the end of the Oslo process, or when there was still a process and some hope for a peaceful resolution to the conflict. I joined the army, as you correctly said. I served in a tanks unit and continue to serve as a reservist today. And before BICOM, I was working actually in the Prime Minister's office as a civil servant, working with the foreign press.
Excellent. And can you share with our viewers what you do now in Jerusalem?
Absolutely. Well, BICOM, the Britain-Israel Communications and Research Centre, we're an independent organisation based to try and create a more supportive environment for Israel in the UK. And we essentially do that by creating a better understanding, a more nuanced picture of the political reality here in Israel.
Maybe you can give our viewers some sort of insight into the political realities in Israel now, because we've seen that the US-sponsored peace talks between the Israelis and the Palestinians are on the verge of collapse. Can you explain to us some of the background information to what has led us to this moment in time?
For sure. Well, I think it's worth looking at some short-term and long-term factors. If we look at the short-term factors, first of all, as you correctly noted, just a few weeks ago, we reached the deadline of Kerry's 9-month process, which ended at the end of April. There were efforts by Israel and by the US to continue this process, to extend the talks and to arrive at a framework agreement. Unfortunately, just hours before the Israeli government agreed to endorse this deal, and by the way, it would have led to another release of 400 odd Palestinian prisoners, some of whom are terrorists and murderers in the eyes of Israelis. Hours before that, the Palestinians instead made their own unilateral move to join some international organizations, and that scuppered the deal. And then to kind of compound the problems, several days later, the Palestinians, even though the negotiators thought there were still some creative solutions to extend the talks, despite of that move to the international organizations, the Palestinians then announced a reconciliation agreement with the Hamas, and that was kind of the last straw that ended this process as we have now. Although I'd be cautious to say it's not ended. I mean, if you listen to the words of the US negotiators, it's in a period of reassessment now, and in fact, the Palestinian government have from the end of April 5 weeks to form a government. So we're kind of in a holding pattern right now to see what will come next.
For example, in the current peace talks, why is time so urgent that the United States is pushing for this deadline? And surely, if we look at the history of the peace process, when the Americans have pushed for particular deadlines, they've never succeeded. So why is Kerry so adamant that there is a particular deadline with these peace talks, or there's consequences that the US has threatened to walk away?
It's a good question, actually. Of why the US are so. I mean, there's the kind of the cliche of saying of wanting it more than the partners themselves. Let's reflect as well. I mentioned that there are some long-term factors here as well, and that this is more than just the 9-month process of the Kerry formulation. But this is a part of a 20-year process that began with Oslo and went through for various stages through Camp David and then through the Annapolis process in 2008 before the most recent reincarnation. And the feeling is for those that believe in the two-state solution, is that time is not working in one's favour, and the necessity is to do a deal as soon as possible. Although I would reject the idea that it's kind of panic stations, that it's been going 20 years and it can go on the status quo, although perhaps not sustainable in the long term. Certainly it's not panic stations. It can last a little while longer yet.
Do you think that maybe something to do with Israel's hesitancy is very much reflected in Israeli public opinion? I mean, over the last decade or so, we've really seen the collapse of the left and the peace camp known as Peace Now, that the Israeli public are very cynical and skeptical about any genuine peace, because every time that Israel concedes territory, Israel's just received violence and terrorism in return. And with that kind of background, how far can the Israeli Prime Minister be pressured into making an agreement without the will of the people, because he has offered the Israeli people a referendum and any future peace talks?
Well, I agree with the second part of your question, but I want to challenge the first part. I don't think we've seen the collapse of a left wing and the collapse of the peace camp at all. In fact, if you look at polling over the last 10 years, there is consistent support for a two-state solution. Over 2/3 of the country support that. And what in fact has happened is that the right and the centre, and this is specifically Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister himself, has embraced some of the arguments which used to be argued 20 years ago, 30 years ago by the left wing. When you hear a Likud Prime Minister talking about the necessity to secure a Jewish and democratic state resulting in a two-state solution, and the more that he's using this language, this is a significant change. that has been adopted by the majority of Israelis. But you are right in your second point that especially after the horrific violence of the Second Intifada, Israelis very much in the advent of the security barrier, which was built there to protect lives first and foremost, Israelis wanted to cut themselves off from the Palestinians. And good fence, the cliche of good fence makes good neighbours, build a fence and to each to his own. But in a slightly wider view, that this needs to be done by negotiations and through agreement with the other side.
What would you make of the Palestinian negotiating position at the moment by applying to 19 members of the UN? So 19 different bodies, the Palestinian Authority have applied for membership. Surely that's in breach of the legal and political framework of the Oslo Accords to try and bring about an international situation rather than actually a peace negotiated situation between the two sides.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think there are 2 or 3 reasons why this is problematic. As you said, it goes against Oslo. More specifically, it goes against the understandings reached at this stage of this 9-month process with Kerry. At the beginning of the process, Israel undertook to release 4 stages of Palestinian terrorists out of the jails. The 4th phase was just being renegotiated when the talks blew up. And in return, the Palestinians agreed not to go for unilateral moves to international organisations to internationalise the conflict. So it's certainly a breach of trust. It's a sense of non-compliance with the most recent agreement they've signed. And I think that finally the most significant element is that these international organisations should be a reward at the end of the process. It should be a part of as a result of the trust built up by the sides, that Israel should ceremoniously welcome the state of Palestine into these organisations alongside a peaceful and secure Israel, and that the Palestinians can rightly take their place once all these other issues have been resolved through negotiations.
And Richard, how significant do you think statements made by Mohammed Abbas that he does not recognise a Jewish state?
I think this is very significant. I mean, I want to challenge something that someone else said in one of your earlier clippings about how big a deal Israel has made of this. There's a lot of misunderstanding. This is not a precondition to the talks. Similarly to the international organisations, which will be a result of a prosperous and successful negotiation. Similarly, the true test that once the core issues have been negotiated and resolved, at the end of the process, it is vitally important that the Palestinians recognise Israel as a Jewish state, that there is the reciprocal recognition, and that Israel isn't some alien implant into this area, that there are the Jewish roots in the land of Israel are real and visceral and are recognised by the community of nations and especially the Palestinians.
And Richard, I've got to ask you, maybe one of the biggest problems or the biggest stumbling block in these peace talks is the current national unity government deal between Fatah and Hamas. And we know that Hamas is an internationally recognised terrorist organisation, and its covenant charter calls for the destruction of the State of Israel and the Jewish people. Surely now the Palestinian Authority lacks international legitimacy for this alliance with Hamas that is surely going to derail the peace process.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is why, as I said, here we are in this 5-week period in a holding pattern to see exactly what will happen. I think, first of all, there is a degree of scepticism. If you recall, over the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen a Doha agreement, a Mecca understanding, and in Cairo as well. This is the 4th attempt of reconciliation between the parties. And one must remember that these parties, the secular Fatah and the Islamic fundamentalist Hamas, haven't become friends overnight. There is still a great deal of animosity, ideological conflict between the two. So I think we're all playing a waiting game to see if, in effect, this unity government can be formed. If it does, then the test of them is clearly the criteria that the international community has laid out for them. Those 3 criteria, which is recognised by, of course, Europe and the US and Russia, as well as Japan and Egypt, that Hamas must recognise Israel, must denounce and refrain from violence, and recognise previous agreements that the Palestinians have signed with Israel.
And Richard, can you give us a little bit of insight or a little bit of analysis into what you think would happen if the peace talks collapse completely? Could Israel face international diplomatic pressure and economic sanctions from the EU and the US?
It's possible, but I think Israel needs to do everything they can to, if in the failure of an understanding with the Palestinians, to reach some understanding with the international community and to reach them to show that they are acting in good faith. I mean, I think first of all, one of the hidden secrets of this process over the last month is exactly what they spoke about for all those hours in the negotiation room has stayed a secret, and it may well stay that way, but it may come out. My understanding, at least, is that the Prime Minister, behind closed doors, Netanyahu, moved significantly to recognise some of the Palestinians' key demands. And I think we should be less worried about the overt rhetoric about what's really understood in the European capitals and in the US of exactly Israel's intentions. And then, of course, the other element is that Israel may find they need to act. There are plenty of other Israeli analysts and policy advisors that talk about a plan B. But although that negotiations is certainly the ideal and the aspired to goal, in spite of the recent setbacks, that maybe Israel needs to take a plan B, which means some form of unilateral move in the West Bank, working in some incremental ways to improve the lives of the Palestinians, and not settle for the status quo, but move forward in small efforts to create a better peace on the ground.
And finally, Richard, what was your interpretation of the news that's occurred today that Israel's former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has been jailed for 6 years and has faced over £1 million fine? That's Israeli shekels.
I think, first of all, it's a very sad day for Israel. When Israel as a young democracy was founded, they never thought that the democracy would take to the extent that both a former president and a former prime minister would both potentially be sitting in prison. As a kind of silver lining, I suppose, it's really the fact that the robust system of the rule of law, that the equality among the law, that no one is above the law, is proving itself. That if you have been found guilty of corruption, then it doesn't matter who you are, even a former prime minister will be punished for it, and that says a great deal for the legal establishment and the rule of law here.
Richard, I want to thank you so much for your time and for joining us today from Jerusalem.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Zelmi, any comments you'd like to make on what Richard has said about the peace process?
I think he's very optimistic about keeping the process going. But it really is just a process. Time and again, it's proved that it's a process. You have to have two willing parties to do the deal. And if one party is just simply not prepared even to recognize you, then it's hopeless. And this becomes a graveyard for secretaries of state who, in the words of Defense Minister Ya'alon, may have been trying to get his Peace Prize and so forth. Everyone would love to be associated with a final conclusion and organizing a final conclusion, that Camp David moment. But really, it's illusory because I don't think Abbas really intended to do much more than get as many prisoners out of jail as was going to improve his standing in the world, in the Arab world. And I think he basically has said to Hamas, you had to go and kidnap Gilad Shalit to release prisoners and hold him for as many years as you held him. We don't even have to do that. We just go to John Kerry, we'll say we'll sit down with the Israelis, but give us 4 batches of prisoner releases. We gave all that, we got nothing, and we didn't even get the most basic thing. So I think it's extremely one-sided. The other idea is the question as to whether Israel is sincere in wanting a peace agreement. Well, I think Netanyahu is pretty savvy, and his coalition and his standing in the Likud is shaky enough because the Likud party itself, which I represent in the UK, is not signed on to the two-state solution. That's Netanyahu. So his position is precarious anyway. And for him to go through further risks in releasing prisoners and causing all this pain and public outrage, if he did not really genuinely want to have a good outcome, it beggars belief. He really did put everything into this, and he was betrayed by this plan. And this reconciliation with Hamas didn't happen overnight. How long have they been alienated? Do you think this happened overnight? No. This was planned, as were the other measures released in the Foreign Ministry's disclosure of the private correspondence with Erekat. This was scuttled by them, and we gave, and we have nothing in return.
Zelmi, when I first heard the news that Fatah had entered into a unity government with Hamas, my first indication was that it seems like the Palestinian Authority are preparing for a third intifada. Because surely the only way that Fatah and Hamas can unite, pretty much hate each other, is the fact that they can be only united around one cause, and that's violence against Israel, and then try to condemn Israel in the Court of Human Rights in The Hague.
Yes, my first reaction was that Kerry really did get his ultimately a two-state solution, but not the one he wanted. He got two terrorist organizations living side by side. They're not that much different, really. Neither recognize Israel. Both have charters calling for the liquidation of Israel. And one does it through politics and the United Nations and the EU, and the other one does it with missiles from Gaza. One wears a tie and one doesn't.
Clashes have taken place in the West Bank between Palestinian protesters and Israeli security forces. The demonstrators are angry that a fourth group of Palestinian prisoners haven't been released, as agreed in a deal brokered by the US last year for the resumption of peace talks between both sides in the conflict.
American Secretary of State John Kerry have been exerting maximum efforts, and we appreciate his relentless and unwavering commitment to achieve a two-state solution. But at the end of the day, it's really the decisions will have to be made by Palestinians and Israelis. We have come a long way. We have recognized the State of Israel's right to exist in 1967.
The talks, which have been taking place since last July, have been close to breaking down this week, with Israelis and Palestinians blaming the other.
Regrettably, in the last few days, both sides have taken steps that are not helpful, and that's evident to everybody. So we are going to evaluate very carefully exactly where this is and where it might possibly be able to go.
Israel has said it will only release prisoners on progress being made in the negotiations and on Palestinians sticking to a deal not to seek membership of international agencies. The US had hoped an agreement would be reached by April 29th.
As you can see from that news clip, it was a couple of weeks old, but that just gives us an indication of where we are now. Zelmi, we saw in that clip, really, John Kerry placing huge pressure upon Israel, and he said some comments recently that have been extremely unhelpful, comparing Israel to an apartheid state, and that Israel can expect more boycotts, divestments and sanctions if Israel doesn't continue the peace process.
Well, I think he didn't actually, in fairness, say that Israel is an apartheid state. He says Israel runs the risk of becoming an apartheid state, or being viewed as an apartheid state. I mean, the apartheid canard is utterly ludicrous. And in fact, when you think about it, there is only one basis upon which Israel and apartheid can be linked together, and that is on a national basis. In terms of apartheid's definition, is the discrimination against a race or colour, purely on the basis of race and colour. Well, Israel, as we all know, is the world's Jew today. They're not allowed to say that they're anti-Semitism. Someone's not allowed to say he's anti-Semitic, but he can say, until the cows come home, I hate Israel, and Israel is this, that, or the other. So it's anti-Semitism by other means. And for the countries of the world, the nations of the EU, to boycott and divest from the Jewish state is pure apartheid. That is, in its purest form, apartheid on a national scale. Your clip also showed a lot of rioting going on. We are in the third intifada. We are seeing something like 100 rock and Molotov attacks per day since this agreement came to an end. It's being kept quiet. Deliberately by the government. There have been protests in Israel whereby police records of these incidents are being published on the internet to awaken the government to its responsibilities to maintain order. I think, and this is my own personal opinion, that Israel is keeping quiet about this until the papal visit is over, Pope will be there for 24 hours, I think, on the 25th, if I'm not mistaken. But I think once that is out of the way, then there will be a major crackdown on what is going on. And it is the Molotov and Rock intifada, unfortunately.
I mean, what surprises me in the whole of this process is that John Kerry, US Secretary of State, has blamed Israel for the failure of the peace talks, and yet the Palestinians themselves have decided to take unilateral moves through the UN to apply to something like 19 different UN organisations and to apply for statehood that way, rejecting the Oslo Accords, which is the legal and political framework of the current peace talks, and to pursue a path completely independent of that of the US or Israel. And surely there should be some international penalties for the Palestinians to continue the current course they're on.
There's no political will in Europe to fight the Palestinians. This whole accord with the Palestinians arose out of the Palestinian hijackings and terrorism in the 70s, and the idea was that there was a revolving door. Hijackers were set free by European countries, and they said, look, just NIMBY, not in my backyard. Okay, just keep it off. And then they would send money to the Palestinian institutions and throw money at the problem, as long as they didn't do their terrorism on European soil. And then this has continued with money flowing out. And so there's no political will and there's no political capital to alienate the Palestinians, who are considered the underdogs, which is why I think in such a hopeless situation, Israel knows its own security needs. Israel has given the Arabs who live in Israel as citizens more freedom than they enjoy in any of the 22 Arab states, Islamic states. And I think the best means of securing a real peace is for Israel to keep investing in giving rights to the Palestinians who are living within their control, because that is a shining example to what should be going on outside.
And surely one of the other issues is at the moment it seems that the Palestinian leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, and we saw in that clip Saib Urkut, who's the chief Palestinian negotiator, are talking about a two-state solution. They're talking about peace. And yet their actions are something completely different. We've seen the level of indoctrination, hatred, glorification of terrorism and violence against Israel and the Jewish people. And the fact that UNRWA sponsored Palestinian textbooks, and within the Palestinian Authority's education system, there's not even a recognition of Israel's right to exist. It's all considered Arabic, it's all considered Palestine, without any reference to a Jewish state whatsoever.
Yes. And using bin Laden's words, not on Muhammad's peninsula. They consider that this is their peninsula and there should not be any Jewish entity. This is not just about Jerusalem. If we gave the whole of Jerusalem back, it wouldn't make any difference at all. And we've seen this. We've seen, Sadat got a bullet in the head, and he was the greatest chance for peace. And look what's happened since then. Abbas doesn't want a bullet in the head. He knows exactly where he's going. He's gotten quite a lot of kudos for getting these prisoners out for no payment at all. So he goes on to the next round.
And we have a news clip now, and this is the Arab League getting together to discuss the peace process.
Arab foreign ministers have held an emergency meeting at the Arab League headquarters in Cairo. They called on the US to step up their efforts to save Middle East peace talks, which are on the brink of collapse. US Secretary of State John Kerry had hoped to conclude a final peace deal by April the 29th. The Palestinian Authority has laid the blame for the talks stalling on actions taken by Israel. Israel has refused to release the fourth installment of the Palestinian prisoners and announced the construction of 708 new settlement homes in the Jerusalem area. And these acts have caused the current crisis. The Palestinian Authority responded by signing 15 global treaties on behalf of the State of Palestine, which in turn angered Israel, which also imposed economic measures. The Arab League has pledged financial aid. The Palestinian side brought the ball back into the Arab arena in a bid to get more political cover and finance, in light of the horizon of these negotiations being clouded and the warnings from the Israeli side that it would impose sanctions on the Palestinian Authority.
Mohammed Sheikh Ibrahim, Euronews, Al Qahira.
Okay. Did he? Okay. And in front of me here is a letter. As you can see, it's Israeli-headed paper from the Israeli Prime Minister's office that was actually published in Haaretz. And I'm just going to read a bit of this. It says, "Dear Dr. Ambassador, I'm writing to draw your attention to the attached document written by Dr. Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator. The document examines and makes recommendations regarding the Palestinian position as of March the 9th, 2014, prior to the White House meeting on the 17th of March and the scheduled 4th regarding prisoner release. It says, in effect, this policy paper presented in early March in preparation for a Palestinian rejection of American proposals and includes, in addition to a highly selective account of the talks so far, a series of recommendations to implement a strategy of unilateral Palestinian actions outside the agreed negotiation framework, page 39, including the submission of instructions on accession to international conventions and specifically to the Geneva Conventions advancing reconciliation with Hamas." Now, this is the most important paragraph. It says, "This document refutes the current Palestinian claim that the decision to apply for accession to the conventions in direct violation of Palestinian obligations and of understanding that enabled the resumption of negotiations in July 2013 was taken strictly in response to what they considered a delay in the release of the fourth lot of prisoners, and it indicates the advancing reconciliation process with Hamas and bringing Hamas into new government was under consideration at the very intensive negotiations that were meant to be underway. As such, the document points to the premeditation and to the Palestinians' calculations to renegade on their commitment and pursue a unilateral strategy regardless of the release of prisoners in a manner that would gravely endanger, if not destroy, the entire peace process." So we're saying here that Saeb Erekat, the chief Palestinian negotiator, has already written a 70-page document, in which he's saying that the Palestinians should reject the current round of peace talks and to pursue Palestinian statehood through the end unilaterally.
Yes, I mean it points to premeditation. That they didn't expect this to end up in any kind of peace agreement because they're just not physically able to sign a document with a country and a nation that it does not recognize. And furthermore, as I mentioned with the case of Sadat, to sign such an agreement would mean total alienation from the Arab League and most likely the same fate as Sadat had. These things, as I say, the Hamas agreement did not happen overnight. Getting this list of European organizations together and planning all of that did not happen overnight. And they got as many prisoners as they could. Maybe they did doubt whether Israel would release its own citizens from jail who were murderers, because those you can't deport those. The prisoners who were released so far would be deported across the border into Palestinian territory. The ones who were Israeli citizens, just imagine if you are a mother whose child was bombed in a cafe, and this murderer walks down the street with his Israeli ID card, and he's freed in an exchange agreement for which we got absolutely nothing. That is a huge political risk for any prime minister, and in a fractured party situation, a coalition situation, as Netanyahu finds himself, even more risky. So we really, as they say in the old expression, we gave, and they didn't. And they did not act honorably. They acted treacherously.
And Salmi, what would you think of the accusations made by the United States government, by the European Union, that it's really Jewish settlements in Judea and Samaria that are the root cause for the collapse of the peace talks?
Well, the first thing is that there weren't any settlements before 1967, but we had unremitting terror way before even independence. Jews were being slaughtered in Hebron in 29. It's never stopped. The Fedayeen, the history books are replete with this. So that is just simply not accurate. Besides which, most people don't know that the actual number of settlers in the West Bank, which actually was our territory. It was given away or taken over by Jordan. And Jordan itself was supposed to be our national homeland until the British gave it away and carved it out for the Arab king. You know, the Israeli settlers currently in the West Bank, and there's 300,000 of them, occupy something like, and I hate using the word occupy, reside in about 2% of the West Bank. There's no issue. There's no issue there. It is pure politics. I don't think the Americans really believe, I don't think the Senate and the Congress really believe that Israel scuttled these talks. They know that Netanyahu and the Israeli cabinet are not stupid, that they wouldn't be giving up all these prisoners and risking all of this political capital for something which was a completely no-brainer, which they themselves wanted to scuttle. It doesn't make any sense at all. But there's no dividend in America criticizing the Palestinian side, because it needs to placate and keep the Arabs happy for the oil and for all the other trade that goes with it. Israel, they can beat up Israel because they can. There's no price to pay.
But surely that there will be a price to pay in the near future, surely, because what we've really seen with the Obama administration ever since Obama took power is that he's taken a hostile position towards Israel. He's also done that with Israel, with America's allies, embrace the enemies of the United States, but really attacked America's close allies, and Israel's certainly America's closest ally in the Middle East. What do you think the long-term implications will be for the US-Israeli relationship?
Well, I think, in the case of Obama, some people say he's anti-Semitic. I don't believe that for 1 second. He has a lot of advisors who are Jewish and so forth. I think, unfortunately, Obama is a victim of the people he hung out with in his youth. He hung out with a lot of Palestinians and radicals like Bill Ayers of the Weather Underground. He learned his economics from Saul Alinsky. He's a victim of what he's been brought up with. And I think as he gets to the end of his presidency, he's learned more and more that Israel is not the pariah that he was brought up to believe. But by that time, it'll all be over and it'll all be finished. Perhaps as an elder statesman, he will perhaps appreciate Israel more. As to the future, you tell me who the next president's going to be. I think we have a lot of good friends in Congress. And I think the vast majority of Americans who are polled are very, very solidly behind Israel. And ordinary people do understand the difference between democracy and tyranny, good and evil. And I think this is really the archetypal struggle between good and evil.
Yeah. And we have an interview with the Israeli Prime Minister himself, Benjamin Netanyahu.
A terrorist organization committed to our destruction that condemned the United States for killing bin Laden. That's who Hamas is. That's the organization that the Palestinian president, Abbas, embraced. I was hoping that he would embrace peace with Israel. Instead, he chose a pact with Hamas. And that effectively is what is killing peace. I hope he changes his mind, because the only way we can move forward is to have partners who are committed to living with Israel and not killing the state of Israel.
Is the peace process officially dead?
If he continues with the pact with Hamas, he's essentially buried it. He was wading in the water of the Rubicon. I had hoped that he would cross it and recognize the Jewish state. I had said that peace requires mutual recognition of the Jewish state of Israel and the Palestinian state. A few days ago, we got signs that something was wrong, because he said, I won't even negotiate recognizing a Jewish state. And now, several days later, he's basically taken not a small step backward, a giant leap backward, and embraced one of the preeminent terrorist organizations of our time, committed to the annihilation of the Jewish state, committed in its charter to the murder of Jews wherever they are.
Obviously, the U.S. and Israel characterize Hamas as a terrorist organization, but how would you assess the state of Hamas as a terrorist organization? Is it bigger? Is it better than it was a year ago, 5 years ago? Or is it weakened, and that is a sign of what this accord was about?
Well, first of all, in those years, they fired about 10,000 rockets and missiles on our cities, on our children, on our schools. They dig tunnels in order to send suicide bombers and kidnappers and terrorists into our communities. Tunnels between the seam line of Gaza and the state of Israel. They are involved in terror organizations everywhere, including in the West Bank. So they've not relented one bit on their terror activities. It hasn't changed their animosity to the United States of America. You know, they oppose us, but they say that we're just a small Satan. The U.S., is the big Satan. And it's the big Satan they hate.
Mr. Prime Minister, this is what the chief negotiator for the Palestinians had to say. Quote, Mr. Netanyahu and his government were using Palestinian division as an excuse not to make peace. Now they want to use Palestinian reconciliation as an excuse for the same purpose. This is utterly absurd. The only logical conclusion is that Netanyahu's government does not want peace.
Well, you know, they can do intellectual somersaults from here to eternity, but it doesn't change the fact that they chose to make a pact with people committed to our destruction, and that doesn't square away with peace. You know, you want to make peace, then don't embrace terrorists who want to destroy the state of Israel. And there's no two ways about it. They can talk, they can't talk their way through this. It's a blow to Israel. It's a blow to peace. I'll tell you something. I think, Brett, it's a terrible blow to the Palestinian people, because they must choose, too, whether they want to go forward or go backward. Yesterday, with a pact with Hamas, the Palestinian people took a huge step backward, away from peace.
That was the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation deal. Zelmi, a very important question also when we're looking at the Palestinian side, and that is what does Mahmoud Abbas, leader of the Palestinian Authority, mean when he says that he wants to see a two-state solution?
Well, the two-state solution he wants one state for the Palestinians, without a single Jew in that state. He's gone on record to say no Jew will be able to live in the West Bank once a state is declared. And then he wants another state, which is not, he doesn't want to recognize it as a Jewish state, but that state he wants to have, as Jews and Arabs, a state made up of its citizens. And he hopes that that state will, through demographic birth rates and so forth, completely disintegrate and ultimately subsume in Israel's democratic system the Jewish state and make it effectively self-destruct. That's his view, and that's really what he wants, and that's why it is so difficult for him, impossible for him, to recognize it as a Jewish state.
Which is alarming, which makes you think that why is Israel being forced to accept these peace terms, which effectively is putting a gun to someone's head, to accept this, or it's suicide?
Well, the answer is, why is it being forced, is because it's allowing itself to be forced. If you see a kid giving out sweets on the street corner, you'll say, I'll bet they aren't your sweets, because if they were your sweets, you wouldn't be giving them out. And I think when we start treating Israel as if we really did own it, and that it was our biblical heritage, and it was the gift that was promised to us, then I think there will be a change in dynamics. I think we have to start acting as if it's real, as if it's ours, as if we're going to keep it. We're willing to share it. We've shown that we are willing to share it. We have 1.8 million Arabs, living with full rights, education, universities, healthcare, everything. We're prepared to share it, but it's got to be our land. It's got to be our state where our people will be safe under the Zionist dream.
And what do you think the future is if we see this Palestinian constant demands to pressure Israel, and effectively Israel's in a war, but it's more of a political and diplomatic war, using the leverages of the international community in order to pressurize Israel, in order to make more and more concessions. In the long term, I mean, it very much seems like this is the implementation of the phased plan that Yasser Arafat came up with back in the 60s, to take Israel stage by stage, because clearly they are not preparing their own people for peace and reconciliation with Israel.
That's correct. Everything is a springboard to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage of eventually pushing Israel into the sea. The irony is that all the energy that we found in the sea now they're going to say that it's not ours either. So they're not going to allow us into the sea either. I think really the only roadmap here is the roadmap which was set out by God, and that is that the Jews will return to their land and they will live freely and will plant vineyards and they will, build cities. And that's exactly what is happening. Despite everything else that's going on, secretaries of state may come and go, Europeans may come and go. The fact of the matter is what's happening in Israel is real. There used to be a T-shirt, Israel is real. It is no truer than it is today.
And finally, Zan, we're coming down to the last 4 minutes of the programme. Can I ask you what you think of the news development this week that Israel's former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has been sentenced to 6 years in prison for corruption and also faced a million Israeli shekel fine for being involved in corruption?
Look, it's a great day for Israel's democracy. It shows that no one is above the law, even the Prime Minister. And as a matter of fact, looking at the apartheid comment we made a few minutes ago, it was an Arab judge that sent ex-President Katsav to prison. I'd like to see that happening under an apartheid state one day. I think Mr. Olmert took bribes. Yes, he's been sentenced for that. But I think compared with the bribery and corruption which exists, I'm not just saying even just in the Arab world, and we've all heard about those taped conversations with Turkey's leader, Mr. Erdogan, talking about billions of euros. This is very small beer, which Olmert took, and yet he's paying an immense price. So I think this is an amazing example of justice, justice you shall seek, which is the charter of the Jewish legacy to the world, that we have to be a light unto the nations. And I just wonder where and when the next Prime Minister or ex-Prime Minister of any country is going to find himself in this kind of hot water and a 6-year jail term for a few $100,000.
Zalmi, I just want to thank you so much for being my guest here on the European Report. I'm ashamed you can't join us in the European Parliament in Brussels, but maybe sometime soon.
Thanks.
And I want to thank you for watching today's programme as we've discussed the complexity of the Middle East peace process. It's important that we understand what's going on and how that, for example, diplomacy and politics is being used as a weapon against the modern state of Israel, and that within the legal framework, the Palestinian Authority cannot legally go down the path of unilateral action by applying to 15 member organisations of the UN to declare a unilateral independence without the current peace talks. So let's continue to pray that the Israeli Prime Minister has wisdom in knowing how to conduct these affairs, and thank you for watching today's European Report.